Welcome everybody to our second in this lecture series on why capitalism is broken and how we can overthrow it. I'm Jane, I'm the Political Education Officer for the Young Greens and would like to welcome you all today. If you attended the first lecture and you've come back, welcome back. Absolutely amazing to have you. Hopefully you've already seen some of the resources that we've put up from the last lecture. We've got the full recording, it's on the website, and some further reading. So hopefully you can take a little look at some of that. If this is your first lecture and you didn't join us last week, then hey, welcome. Hope you're going to enjoy this lecture today. And of course, I would say if you want to watch what happened last week, catch up on everything, then the link to the website with that recording and with all the resources is just going into the chat now. So hopefully you can all see that, the link to our website. Cool, so we've launched this series because our society is in crisis. The pandemic, it's revealed deep flaws in our neoliberal capitalist system. So the climate crisis, health crisis, economic crisis, and employment crisis, each of these are demanding that we need to take a radical step away from existing political and economic order. But in order to change the world around us, first we need to actually understand it and understand how we got here. And then only then we can find routes to achieving a radical change. And so that's why we've come up with this lecture series. And we've been able to do this with the help of our funders. That's the Federation of Young European Greens and supported by the European Youth Foundation and the Council of Europe. But this lecture is just one little part, or this lecture series is just one little part of our political education agenda that we're planning this year. And I'm just going to quickly pass over to Rosie, our Young Green co-chair, who will tell you a little bit more about what that's going to look like. Over to Rosie.
Thanks so much, Jane, and welcome everybody. Welcome. It's so great to see so many of you turn up again. And whether you're a member or a non-member or a young green or a forever young green in your heart, welcome. It's so great to have you all here. And as Jane said, we're really excited about this lecture series, but also because it really does kick off. We hope this builds the foundations for what we hope to really deliver over the following weeks to come. So following this kind of 4-part series that really delves down into that grounded understanding of these quite complex conceptual frameworks and building our political analysis of the world around us. We will be following this up with weekly Q&As and talks with organisations and activists, policy experts and amazing grassroots campaigners from a range of organisations, from Green New Deal UK to Electronics Watch to refugee rights charities and campaigns. Lots to come that we really hope that you look out for. And then secondly, we have a range of online activist trainings ready to go that we're just building now. We have a press and media training planned, digital mobilising, movement building and campaigns. So an awful lot to look forward to, and we really do hope that you'll keep an eye out and you'll come along to those because that will really, hopefully help you be a part of a really important movement. You can also, though, help grow this work. We really want it to continue to build, continue to see more and more people attending. And you can do this very simply by just donating the amount of a cup of coffee once a month. £3 a month would help us to do 3 really important things. It would help us to reach thousands more people with our online ads for these talks and events. It would help us to up our tech package. One of the things we're looking into, and hopefully we can get working tonight also, is a live transcription for people who are hard of hearing or are deaf. And also our third thing is helping us to deliver more and more online talks and trainings, particularly bringing in expert campaigners to facilitate and lead the top quality stuff. So if you can help us do that, then I'm going to stick a link in the chat. Every penny will be used very wisely, and we'd really appreciate it. But that's all from me, and thanks very much. Really looking forward to this evening. Back to you, Jane.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rosie. Great, so our lectures are being delivered by the wonderful Sam Coates. He spent many years managing major election campaigns, designing and implementing activism strategies, and has helped to found a new political startup. And he is also was previously a Green Party county councillor in Oxfordshire, and he is a Young Greens alumni. He was the former co-chair of the Young Greens. Woo! Cool. So today Sam's going to lead us through the changing state of democracy in the UK. So we're going to look at where power lies and why, radical social movements, and the rise of independence movements. After the lecture, we'll do a Q&A, which will last about 20 minutes. If you have any questions that you want to ask in that Q&A, if you can send those just directly to me, so my name says questions here, that'd be great. I'll then collate all those questions and then we'll give them to Sam at the end. If you have any questions of a technical nature, then if you could send them to Rosie. So if that's questions about Zoom, or if you require the presentation in an accessible format, if you just drop a direct message to Rosie and she'll be able to help you out with that. And that's it. Without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Sam now.
Hello, good evening, everyone. It's fantastic to see so many people back again and interested in kind of getting ourselves educated on how this world works and how we're going to make sense of the problems that we're seeing right now. And it's so awesome to see that this is just one small part of what the Young Greens are doing as part of this program. So yeah, so incredible to watch what's going on. So let's move that off then. Welcome back to the series. So here is them mapped out. As you can see, last week we talked about neoliberalism, privatization and austerity, which is really looking at the kind of history of economic development in the world and in Britain as well, to kind of help us think about what are the underlying factors that are influencing a lot of the other stuff that's going on in society, and why our political ideologies are the way that they are. Today, in the second series, we're talking about the changing state of democracy in the UK, which is really trying to look at the structural factors that have influenced how our democracy has developed, both kind of within Europe as a whole, but also the UK in particular, and this very strange ancient system we have, and why perhaps that still exists when it's really one of the only types of ancient systems left in the world. So if you're thinking about questions like, why do people seem to vote against their self-interests? Why do lots of people think that people who vote Tory are stupid or selfish? And why is the UK still so centralised and unaccountable? We're going to hopefully give you some of the resources you need to engage with those questions, and maybe we'll talk about those a little bit in the Q&A. But before we kick off, I just wanted to ask you, so hopefully we'll enable the chat in a moment, just to ask you to give a really short definition of how you would define democracy. What on its kind of most fundamental level does it mean to you? And whilst we're waiting for some of those to come in, I'll just say what the structure for the session tonight is going to be. So we're going to look in a bit of depth about what actually is democracy, kind of conceptually, how people thought about it in history. We'll then be talking about how it developed within Europe as a whole, before then looking at the peculiar case of the UK, how that differs to the rest of the world. We'll then be looking at how that's influenced the politics that we have today and why it seems so difficult to get reforms, how elites have exploited this situation in recent years, and the breakup of Britain, and the need for a democratic revolution. So everyone having a voice in decisions made, that sounds really good to me. There's so many coming in, it's difficult to keep track of. So one person, one vote, that's a very common one. People having a say in decisions and leaders, broken, people power, equal opportunity to vote, everyone having a voice, ruled by all the people, interesting. A voice for the collective is greater than those in power. So there's so many there. That's really fantastic. Thank you so much. We'll move on from there. So in its simplest form, democracy is the combination of two ancient Greek words, demos and kratos, meaning rule by the people or by the majority. And it's distinct from other forms of government by various types of minority, whether that's kings or oligarchs. So what do we mean by rule exactly? Just a vote in an election? or actually playing a role in governing, like some of you have said already in your definitions. So the first usage of democracy in the West was in ancient Athens, where every citizen, not women and not slaves, of course, had the right to attend meetings in the city assembly. So while there were delegated positions of power and people that made decisions and who governed all year round, every citizen could take part in debates and decisions directly. The assembly was a critical space for debates to take place and for opinions to be formed as a collective, which is very different to how our politics seems to work today. But that's not all. The ancient Athenians were watchful of that democracy being dominated in practice by a single family or clan or set of interests. So they had rules including making sure that delegates were paid to compensate for not being able to work, and they understood that wealth inequality had to be controlled to prevent this. After the fall of that democracy, the West didn't really see it again until the American Revolution. But right from the start, political philosophers were saying how terrible an idea it is. Plato, who sometimes talked about as like the grandfather of Western political thought, said that we should instead have philosopher kings. He thought that people would inevitably be rational. But when you go through history and look at all these critiques of democracy, it tends to boil down to one thing really, which is that the elites that are pontificating about this are really worried about the majority taking all their stuff. So whereas the Athenian model had a lot of elements of direct democracy, the new American system was representative democracy. Sorry, I think I said after the fall of democracy, the West didn't see democracy again until the American Revolution. It was quite different. So whereas the Athenian model had a lot of elements of direct democracy, the new American system was representative. So people voted for delegates to make decisions on their behalf. But right from the start, people like James Madison, one of the architects of this system, was concerned with insulating the system from what he might term popular passions or tyranny of the majority. When we talk about tyranny of the majority, they weren't talking about the plight of black slaves and the fact that the white majority was oppressing them or anything like that. It was about protecting the wealth and power of the elite. Democracy had to be designed in ways to prevent the working class from redistributing all of the richest stuff. So whether by formal limits or by ideological control, elites have always tried to define democracy in a narrower way than most of us. And this was not popular democracy, but limited government. And there's a really interesting quote from a book that I unfortunately haven't read yet, but have heard a lot about, Democracy Against Capitalism, where the author says that representative democracy is not the exercise of political power, but its relinquishment, its transfer to others, or its alienation. But as early as the 17th century, radicals held to the ideal of popular democracy. During the English Civil War, rank-and-file soldiers were petitioning Cromwell for popular sovereignty and elections in 1647. We'll come back to that later on. But these movements from below for democracy always combined demands for popular rule and improved living standards for the popular or working classes. From the end of the 18th century onwards, the spread of capitalism in Europe was creating a new class of business owners becoming quite rich, but not able to exercise political power, which was still hoarded by the aristocracy or through the feudal system. So we talked last week about how different class systems changed over time, where you used to have a peasant class that was ruled over by a kind of feudal landed class, and how that changed over time to be instead a working class or a proletariat who were forced to sell their labor to a class of people that owned everything, or the bourgeoisie. So the aristocracy in these feudal systems were basically large extended families and their patrons. The state, as we think about it today, didn't really exist in that sense. It was invested more in the people within those systems rather than offices or anything like that. And these feudal regimes were absolutist. And that means there was no formal checks on their power. The power was arbitrary. Whereas the emerging middle and bourgeois classes standed to gain more from a rules-based order that was more impersonal, that was more meritocratic in the sense that how much money you had mattered more than what family you came from. So a dynamic of class conflict had emerged. The bourgeoisie had opposing interests to that of the aristocracy, because one of them was making money from hiring workers to produce things and to sell them. The other, that still ruled, was making money by charging rents on the land that they controlled. So what happened over this period was that the bourgeoisie tended to lead the working class to try and depose these old feudal regimes for a form of what was called bourgeois democracy. And that often didn't mean that working people got much benefit from those new systems in the short term. So from the 19th century onwards, Europe is plagued by social unrest and revolutions, both successful and unsuccessful. Some are about nationalist movements, breaking free from old empires. Some are against feudal regimes, and we see the start of liberal democratic institutions. Where absolutism had come before, we see the emergence of ideas like checks on government power, things like independent judiciaries, separations of power. But who exactly got to check that power was perhaps less the point than the fact that it was separated. In many of these new countries where elections were taking place, the vote is often restricted to men with property, either through property qualifications or through not having a secret ballot. So who you vote for is a matter of public record, and you can be evicted if you vote for the wrong person, for example. And women, of course, almost never had the vote until much later on. At the same time, underneath these bourgeois revolutions, where the aristocracy were being displaced by the new capitalist class, workers are being crammed into terrible conditions in huge factories, but are talking to each other about how to improve their conditions. They're trying to build trade unions, but they're also talking about seizing political power for the benefit of the majority. So there are two different ideas emerging from different places. The bourgeoisie and its ideas of limited government or liberal democracy, with checks and balances on government power, and limits to who makes up the demos, of course. So remember, slaves were not part of the demos, women were not part of the demos, black people were not part of the demos in the emerging American democracy. And within the working class and its intellectuals, the talk is instead of popular democracy that is fundamentally entwined with economic conditions. What then happens through the turn of the century is that the working class are exercising their democratic rights, and sometimes that's only freedom of expression or freedom of speech, so they haven't got the vote yet, to win extension of voting rights to all men, and building political parties to win political power as a means to replacing capitalism with socialism. In this sense, political parties are fundamentally social organisations that seek to represent their members in parliament. So a socialist party would be a formation of trade unions, other socialist organisations that are out there in society. They have a social base, their members are taking part in them quite regularly, and the goal of them standing elections is for those people to be represented. They aren't always class-based, these modern political parties. Sometimes they're religious or divided on other lines, and we saw that in parts of Germany, Belgium, Ireland, and the US. But they, to varying extents, have their social clubs or their bars, their insurance schemes for workers, and lots of other things that bind people together in a collective consciousness. The pinnacle of this was perhaps the German SPD, the Social Democratic Party, that was highly integrated with the unions, and where workers could often spend most of their lives within its purview. They'd be drinking on the weekend with their union colleagues in a SPD-run bar, for example, while going to reading groups and all this kind of thing. Likewise, conservative parties had the church, the armed forces, and other pastimes that bound their members together into more of a social movement. And it's worth just saying briefly at this point that in the UK, the Labour Party was quite a weak form of this. It was more of a federation of trade unions rather than a kind of central coordinating body and a focal point for all working class organisation. So the understanding of what democracy is in practice and the one that we have today was quite contingent, and what we mean by that is they're the material results of chance events rather than being preordained or some rule of history. And that's based on the events of the Industrial Revolution and the class consciousness that emerged from it, and you have the mass society of the working class. And as a result, you have mass parties with millions of members all across Europe. This was the norm for a long time. this situation held for a lot of the 20th century. We'll come back to how that ended a bit later on. But we're going to go and talk about the British case just in a little minute. So there's two visions of democracy emerging here. Popular democracy, which is participatory, redistributive, inseparable from economic change, and organised through mass parties, and that's how the working class takes part. And then on the other hand, you've got liberal democracy, which means separation of powers, protections against the majority dominating a minority, things like the rule of law, individual rights, the right to hold property, and so on. And working class movements tried to use the space created in their societies by this new liberal democracy to bring about revolutionary change, so trying to make it more of a popular democracy. Now, at various times, people have held both of these things together. Sometimes people have only really thought about liberal democracy. But I would like us to launch one of our polls now, if that's okay, Rosie. So we have a poll which says, what do you think are the essential elements of democracy? So hopefully we'll launch that in just a wee minute. There we go. So let's give you a minute to vote on that. So we seem to be seeing quite a pattern here. Just give you another few seconds to vote before we close the poll. Okay, we'll close that now, if that's okay, and show the results to people. So which do you think are the essential elements of democracy? So the popular element, the political or liberal element, or they're both equally important? And yeah, that's the answer I think I was expecting from you folks. So by very large margin, they're both equally important. That's great. Thanks very much. So what have we talked about so far in the history of democracy? So it can come in different forms. The earliest form was popular and participatory, but how it's been talked about over time has changed. And it emerged again in the 18th century, primarily as a way for the propertied classes to break free from arbitrary feudal rule. And working class movements saw democracy as a means of liberation or revolution. But in most countries, there was an alliance between the working class and the bourgeois classes to bring down those old ancient regimes where almost no one had any real political rights. During the 20th century, mass parties gave the working class representation within parliaments or governments. So we're now going to tackle the not insignificant issue of the history of the British state. So how did democracy develop differently in the UK to other European countries? And why is our unusual history so relevant today to what's happening to us? So the British state started out pretty similar to any other, really. It was a feudal system based around a monarchy and an aristocracy that pretty much together actually made up the state rather than any independent offices or institutions. But in the 1600s, we had the English Civil War, and that was a war between the king and parliament, between the divine right of kings to rule without question and his accountability to parliament. But this was also highly wrapped up in feuds over religion at the time. And remember, at this time, the parliament wasn't really anything more than an assembly of nobles. It wasn't in any way a democracy in the way we understand it today. So the English Civil War had some similarities with the later revolutions in Europe in that it was against absolutism. But it was too early in historical development to be fundamentally a class conflict between feudalism and capitalism. Not enough had happened yet for that. So despite that, there were democratic energies emerging. In 1647, the Civil War was on pause, and rank and file soldiers known as the Levelers were condemning those who sat in Parliament, demanding popular sovereignty. So popular sovereignty is where power is derived, political power and authority is derived from the people, as opposed to a monarch or as opposed to a parliament And today in the UK, we still talk about this thing called parliamentary sovereignty. So they were demanding popular sovereignty and mass involvement in democracy. These demands were inconceivable to Cromwell, his generals, and the parliamentary elite, who insisted on property qualifications and said this could only lead to anarchy. Soon after, Britain was a republic for 11 years, but it was just as undemocratic as before. So the English Civil War was the first unusual thing that happened in European history in Britain. So at this point, the British state was stuck in a kind of in the middle. It started its development away from being a feudal state, but it hadn't finished its development towards being a bourgeois democratic state that is more organized, more rules-based, and so on. We also had a pre-industrial empire in the British Empire, in that, as opposed to later examples where they were using their industrial might and armies to conquer other parts of the world, Britain used its naval power to conquer other parts of the world and expropriate its resources and expropriate other peoples. So this was happening before capitalism really kicked off. So resources could just be brought to Britain for the benefit of the middle classes and the upper classes in Britain. And this created a lot of wealth around the upper echelons of British society that stopped feuds emerging. It just provided a source of stability for the kind of classes that could really pick a fight with the ruling elite at the time. And the other different case is that Britain was the first place in the world where the Industrial Revolution kicked off. So as a result, it happened a bit more gradually than it did in other places, where it was often, in some ways, a decision to industrialize quickly, for example. So this gave the kind of original feudal, post-feudal ruling class the space to maybe understand what was going on and to find a way to incorporate this new emerging bourgeois class into that, what you might call a patrician, elitist governing class, rather than it being swept away by a new democratic system. So the British state got stuck between feudalism and bourgeois democracy, and we're still living with that today in lots of ways. So kind of in the background of this, you've got working class movements for democracy in Britain. So we've already talked about the Levellers, who were petitioning Cromwell during the Civil War. Fast forward a bit more than a century later, and the French and American revolutions were sparking a new movement among the masses in Britain. It was kicked off a bit earlier in the 1760s, but by the 1790s, Thomas Burke's Rights of Man, which stressed universal rights rather than kind of feudal caste, sold over 200,000 copies in Britain. Hundreds of thousands of people were rallying in London for change. Reform societies were popping up all over Britain before a ruthless crackdown by authorities saw the book banned, and huge crackdowns on lawful assembly. All political meetings all meetings of people over 50 had to be reported to the authorities. And trade unions were banned in 1799. So you can already see this kind of emerging alliance between the bourgeois class and the feudal class against the workers moving forward. And that period was kind of full stop really in 1819, when 80,000 workers rallied in Manchester to demand parliamentary reform. So this was things like annual parliaments, universal manhood suffrage, the secret ballot, and all these things would have added up. If these demands had been granted, it would have meant sweeping away of the feudal state and of the bourgeois classes as well. It would have been a revolution. So those workers in Manchester were charged by troops, 15 were killed and hundreds were injured, and that's now referred to as the Peterloo Massacre. So why didn't the middle class unite with the workers to overthrow this old order as they were about to in the rest of the world? So in 1832, the first serious reform of Parliament in centuries happened. Urban areas were given some seats to balance these new growing places against the rotten boroughs, the rural shires that sometimes had no one voting in them, and MPs were picked by landowners. And some propertied men, a lot of this bourgeois class that we're talking about, didn't previously have the vote, but they were largely given the vote by this 1832 reform of who was able to vote. But almost without exception, workers who by chance had had a vote because of some local peculiarity had it removed. They no longer had the vote. And this was the old elite's ability to compromise. They saw this coming. The historical events rolled out in a way that meant that they could incorporate this new rising class that wasn't a threat to property and unite against the working class. So by the time class alliance had emerged between the bourgeoisie and the old feudal elite, capitalism was now becoming dominant, with people cleared from the land and forced into inhumane and living conditions and working conditions, as we explored in the previous session. But these workers were becoming class consciousness of their common interests, and they were organising increasingly. So Scottish theorist Tom Nairn, and he's a very old guy now, he's 88, but he was a very important thinker in what's called the New Left in the 1960s, which was kind of a post-Soviet socialist current within Europe. And he really wrote in the 70s kind of a really comprehensive theory of why the British state is still the way it is. And we've already talked about some of those features. So wealth extracted from the empire and the wealth that could be redistributed to this rising middle class allowed a compromise with the old landed aristocratic elite. But crucially, these new elements were incorporated into a pre-existing culture of how to rule the people, and it was not a democratic set of ideas, it was an elitist set of ideas, that there was a class of people who had got into their position because they were naturally the right people to rule. And that meant that democracy was not really a good thing. It would only be given a threat of revolution. But crucially, this class alliance happens before the working class can become conscious, because the first two classes are working out what's going on before capitalism has really started to take up a majority of the poor. And of course, in 1832, much of the middle class or the bourgeois class gets the vote. So we just said this compromise creates a class of liberal intellectuals that embrace and promote compromise with the old regime rather than rupture. So whereas we saw emerging intellectuals and a middle class in other European countries that wanted political power, but didn't have it because of the old feudal regimes, they were inciting the workers to revolt, they were inciting revolution that they could then lead and then become the agents of that new state. But what happened in Britain is that equivalent class was instead promoting compromise with the old regime. And this can be really seen as a governing strategy throughout the last couple of centuries, really, where the British state only gives away the minimal amount of reform that it thinks is necessary to prevent outright revolution and overthrow of the system. And there's two classes in this alliance rather than just the old feudal class. So a bit more about the Chartists in 1832. This is a real violent period in British politics. It's this revolutionary ferment all over the place. The working class are getting educated, getting organised. They're so angry about their situation. So in 1839, more than 1 million people sign a petition for democratic reform. And another petition, after that's rejected by Parliament, goes up to 3 million in 1842. And just to give you a sense of that, that's the equivalent of 12 million people signing a petition by hand in today's society. It's astonishingly big. You have marches of 300,000 people demanding bread and revolution. There's nothing, there's no two ways about what they're calling for there, is there? And a shadow parliament is elected by something resembling workers' councils across the UK, and armed uprisings are planned during the 1830s. Only Newport in Wales ends up happening in the end, and it's crushed by the army. A final petition is rejected in 1848 for the same demands, but all along, as well as the original political demands for universal manhood suffrage, for the secret ballot for annual parliaments and payment of MPs to allow working class people to be MPs, so on, this expands into an ever-growing list of economic demands for reform. So you can see that from the start, these demands for democracy are inseparable from economic and social change. That 1848 petition is rejected by Parliament again. Plans for insurrection, revolution are planned, but they're foiled by the state. Now, you could say, you can't say for certain, but it's certainly very relevant here that the working class was on their own in this attempted revolution. That without the bourgeois classes helping them out, without elements of the army helping them out, they had no chance against the might and the violence of the state. Now, we can have to be sure about that. Could the workers have possibly prevailed? We don't know. That's a relevant consideration. So after this point, the working class is kind of, I suppose, aware that they're outgunned and they can't use the same sort of tactics that they were using before. So they turn towards reform within the system and gradual improvements. So trade unions turn to gradual improvements in working conditions, for example. And as the 19th century ends, men finally get the vote in 1884. Women with property finally get it in 1918, and all women get it in 1928. But we should view this as part of the ruling elite's strategy of minimal acceptable compromise on wider world events at the time. So throughout that period, there was the talk of revolution across Europe. The Russian Revolution had just happened in 1917, and working class radicalism was very strong in the immediate period after the First World War. So maybe we should see those, we're told that women were given the vote as a reward for the First World War, but you maybe could look at it and say, oh, if we give middle class women the vote, the leadership will be quiet, and it minimizes the risk of larger working class or revolutionary uprisings. Who knows? So where does this bring us? So there was an early alliance between the aristocracy and the industrial bourgeoisie that prevented the revolutionary ruptures like elsewhere. And the labour movement decided to work within this old system rather than replacing it. It's important to note that a lot of this kind of liberal intellectual class that we're talking about, that was saying to people, reform within the system, jumped ship from the Liberal Party to the Labour Party in the early part of the 20th century, which would have encouraged the shift that was already happening from revolutionary socialism to working within the system and parliamentarism, which meant that it left the unreformed British state in place. And it shows why in 1945 we have those massive majority Labour government basically left the whole constitutional architecture of the country where it was. So we still have an unwritten constitution that centralises power. So all power lies with Westminster. They can undo pretty much any law. There's no real checks on its power, while letting governments almost make up the rules as they go. And the British state has no founding myth or ideology like in France, where they have liberté, égalité, and fraternity, allowing it to adapt to the changing needs of the elite. So this kind of patrician elite class is going to all the private schools, they're in the right social networks, and they find their way into the state in these governing capacities, which means that the real ideas shaping how you rule Britain are still quite elitist. They're not egalitarian in the way that you might find in a democracy that's being consciously designed, rather than this post-imperial state that's had democracy grafted onto it, really, and only changing very slowly. So I wanted to pull out this quote from Tom Nen, which is a bit complicated, and remember, you can watch this, the video of this back again, you can get the slides. So if any of this is a bit complicated, and it is, then you can always go back to it. But I just want to read this out, that it has preserved not only the medieval forms, but the medieval essence, that the king governed, but conditionally, not absolutely. That's because of the Civil War. At the heart of the English political system, there was always a core of officials who initiated, formulated, and executed policy, and political opposition has never sought to abolish this key nucleus of the working constitution, but only to control it. What was preserved was the essence of rule from above, in that transitional mode established by 1688, so that transition between the end of the feudal state and this bourgeois democratic state that never came about. And that elite social class took the place of the failed English absolute monarchy. This class framed representative rules for its own members in the most limited version of property-owning parliamentarism. Less the foundation of democracy than a new variety of constitutional aristocracy, like a medieval republic on a grand scale. So there's a lot to take in there, but you can always come back to it. So where did this leave us in terms of post-war democracy? We're just going to rattle through a few of the developments that come out from this, really. So Labour government created a bureaucratic, non-participatory welfare state. Now, we see in the origins of this very elitist state an elitist strain of thought within the Labour Party. You have the Fabian tradition, which is that the working class aren't really capable of knowing what's best for them. Instead, us, the educated elite, are very nice intellectuals, are going to design things for you. And that meant that lots of nationalised corporations, they weren't cooperatives. They were run like private companies, except that the money went back to the state. So you had a bureaucratic, non-participatory welfare state that started to alienate people, especially when from the 60s onwards, you had this highly educated, socially mobile generation that was demanding more say in how society was governed because they felt like they were capable of doing it, quite against the model of Labourism that existed. So then going forward a bit, Margaret Thatcher, we talked a lot about the crisis that she exploited last week. So she exploited this crisis to popularise a new politics where instead of being a citizen, you're a consumer, and you're an individual, you need to look towards individuals rather than collective solutions, which is very much in keeping with the kind of liberal foundations of the British state. And what we've seen since then is that neoliberalism has obscured government power. So we have Quango, so quasi-autonomous non-governmental organisations. So these are things like the Canal Trust, lots of regulatory bodies that make quite boring decisions, but are often quite political, but they're insulated from decisions by politicians to a large extent. And instead of having politics and redistribution, you have regulatory bodies and global institutions that kind of put a lot of political decisions away, out of the confines of democratic debate. And that kind of obscuring of government power has not just happened in Britain, it's happened in Europe as well. And at the same time, those parties that we talked about before, that were mass organisations, turned into a distinct governing class, making decisions on our behalf. So political parties became professionalised. They became a political class that was often very divorced from the people that they served before. And Peter Mayer, a political scientist, called this the non-sovereign public, as most people were pushed out of decision-making and political choices reduced. So around the time that New Labour came into power, a lot of people started to say things like they're all the same, because there weren't many differences in the policy offers, or the kind of way that parties talked about politics. And that was very true. And that was because neoliberalism, which we talked about a lot in the previous session, has depoliticized democracy in a way. You still get a vote, but what are the stakes really in this decision that you're making? Now, the stakes changed quite a lot in the last few years, where the Labour Party was captured by an insurgent, real kind of socialist organisation, but that's now dissipated. And maybe the reason that's dissipated is because of the defences built into the Labour Party that are also attached to this old way of doing things, just like the British state. So neoliberalism has also removed economics from the political debate, and that's given us reactionary populism. Living standards are falling, people can't get houses, we're all familiar with these issues. We can't get the basic things that sustain us. And that's giving us reactionary populism, because no one is offering answers to these solutions. So how have elites handled this fallout? They've done it with right-wing populism. So instead of saying we need to redistribute things from the rich that often practically control the political system, they're blaming minorities for social problems. They're removing the liberal from liberal democracy. So a lot of you will remember thinking back to the last couple of years where the whole Brexit process was going on, and there were arguments about, does the government have the right to trigger Article 50 on its own? Or does it have to be a vote in Parliament? That went all the way through the Supreme Court, and there were media and some politicians calling the judges the enemies of the people. So really attacking that liberal checks of democracy. And of course, since Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, that's become even more of a problem where Parliament was shut down illegally, it turned out, in 2019, not last year. Last year went like a blur, so it's easy to forget it ever happened. But that went to courts, that was declared illegal. So governments have started to weaponize this anger that people have about their lives not changing, this alienation from this British state that just doesn't really engage with them, by conjuring up imagined enemies like migrants or judges. But what's happening is that the power of politicians is being extended in that situation, but these liberal institutions that are meant to be checks are being attacked on all sides. But the powers that the government has on that one side are not being used in the redistributive way that the working class movements imagine them in. They're being used to give more and more money to the rich, as you'll have all seen with the crony contract situation that's been going on during the pandemic. And, you know, people are very vulnerable to this sort of right-wing populism now, because individuals are making atomized political choices. So whereas maybe 40 years ago, what your choice of how to vote, you might not have even thought about it as a choice. It would be derived from your class identity. But even so, you'd be talking to your work colleagues that might well have been in the union. You might have been a member of a working men's club where all these things took place. I know there was working class self-education programs for much of the 20th century where people would be talking about these things collectively. And that's often not the case now, because we live in an atomized society where people work in smaller workplaces. Many people wouldn't dare talk to their colleagues about politics because they're scared of getting into an argument and falling out with people. And of course, the media is owned by billionaires that have an interest in keeping things the way as they are, and against redistribution of wealth, or dealing with environmental problems that are caused by capitalists' overproduction. And what we've seen alongside these attacks by these recent governments on the liberal side, liberal democracy, is that they're gaming the electoral system, they're gaming the rules that are designed to have a level playing field for politics. So we know that the Conservatives overspent in the 2015 election. We know that vote Leave overspent in the referendum to leave the EU. And now either those rules are going to be rolled back by this government, or they're being made unenforceable by weakening the regulators, for example. So that's something we can talk about more in the Q&A if people want the more modern manifestations of what we've been talking about. So last couple of things, the breakup of Britain. Now, many multinational states broke up in Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries over linguistic lines, over cultural lines, over ethnic lines. Hasn't happened in Britain so far. And, you know, what someone like Tom Nairn would say is that this is still the result of the fact that you had that early empire that provided resources from other parts of the world to enrich people in Britain. Yes, the working class as well benefited from colonialism. So any demand that might have come about for splitting away from the UK because it wasn't the best way to organise your government was kind of mollified by that. But what we're seeing now with Brexit, and Brexit really, it can be thought of as the kind of like maybe the final contradictions of this really old ancient system where power is not being given to the people, but it's being diverted in a really strange way. So Scotland nearly went independent in 2014 because of this growing sense that the UK government was not governing in the interests of Scottish people and the values of Scottish people. That was particularly about things like austerity. But now that's growing again, and for the first time really it's growing in Wales, where I live, where it's just grown at an astonishing rate, these calls for people opening their minds towards ending Britain in a way that just would be unthinkable just a few years ago. And that's for quite a few reasons. It's because of Brexit. Some people are just horrified by what Brexit personally means for their idea of what Britain used to be. So my grandfather, for example, he's 86, and his idea of Britain is this kind of redistributive post-war welfare state that looks after you from cradle to grave. Whereas our generation in particular has never had that experience of the British state. It's only done bad things to us. So we've got no emotional attachment to it. And we're thinking, well, if we governed ourselves, if we broke away from this elite class in Westminster that doesn't care about us, then we could do the job a lot better. And looking back to this analysis of how the working class was supposed to unite with the bourgeoisie to change the feudal state, a lot of thinkers in the 20th century thought that it was a class revolution that was going to end Britain. What might be happening instead of that, because the conditions are not amenable to saying, oh, we're going to have a revolution and overthrow the elite, it's being pulled apart from the periphery. So Scotland and Wales saying, well, we as a Welsh nation or we as a Scottish nation are breaking away from the UK. And that's for similar reasons to a class conscious reason for it, but it's more achievable. Breaking up Britain that way is more achievable through that kind of nationalist route. So we can talk more about that in the Q&A if people want to. And of course, Northern Ireland could be set to join the Republic because of all kinds of complications, Brexit. So yeah, these are reactions against the state that is unwilling to change. We said before that it gives you the minimum required change, but it just seems like now because of Brexit that the political class has kind of lost the ability to compromise and to hold things together in that way that has been held up for so long. So what are we going to do about that? A democratic revolution is what I would term it. So democracy was granted to us under pressure from working class organisation. It came about through the Industrial Revolution, the organisation of the working class and demands for a say in how their countries were run. Now, neoliberalism has destroyed those organisations. The unions are really weak, and lots of the other things that held people together and gave people collective relationships are gone. So the elites feel able to roll back democracy because they control the media, they can individually manipulate us via dark Facebook ads, for example. So we need to respond to this by rebuilding democratic infrastructure. So I think we talked last week in the questions about how rebuilding the trade union movement in a modern way is a really important way of doing that. We need grassroots movement, we need alternative media, we need to build out all of this grassroots infrastructure that unites us as ordinary people that have to work for a living, that don't have control over other people, if we're going to challenge the system as it exists. And the specific reforms that the state needs is a whole other conversation. In the Green Party, it's very common to talk about proportional representation, but maybe to reverse that a little bit, why don't we have proportional representation already? I think a lot of the answer to that is in what we've talked about tonight, where it's the minimal reforms possible, and the Labour movement in particular thought that it could just get the keys to the state and enact its policies, leaving the old system intact. So I'll just leave you finally with my reflection that elections are not the main way to build political power. They reflect an already existing balance of forces. So if you can reach people through alternative media, if you can reach people through trade unions and other ways that people talk to each other, rather than have the world mediated through elite media, for example, then we've got a better chance of turning things around and having the kind of revolution in economic life and in the environmental situation that we need to solve. Now, I'm going to say something a bit controversial here. It's not the view of the Young Greens, but that it might be useful to imagine that we don't really live in a democracy at the moment. It's maybe more useful to imagine that we live in a kind of liberal regime where it grants reforms when there's enough sustained pressure through social movements, but that just because we have elections doesn't mean that they're an effective outlet for the change that we want to see. That when we have an election, when people go to vote, that is based on all those imbalances of power that we have in society, whether it's the media or anything else. So elections are a test of our forces, and eventually there might even be a way of gaining power for the majority, but we shouldn't think of it in terms of our outlet. Really, we need to imagine that stuff on the ground, building working class consciousness again, is the way that those elections are ultimately going to be able to be won by the majority. So I'll leave it there. Jane has just mentioned to me that the unions have been growing a lot since the pandemic, particularly some of the public sector unions. So there is hope there, and that's something that we just need to build on. So I think I'm going to hand it over to Rosie that's dealing with the questions, but I hope that made sense to people, and thanks very much again for listening.
Terrific, thank you again, Sam. Like a Zoom round of applause. I don't know how we do this, like the clappy hands emoji, whatever we like. Thank you again for such an unbelievably comprehensive overview of, again, a massive topic which we threw at you to try and run in an hour. But I think that's the kind of history that we don't often here when we're talking about what we mean by radical politics and radical democracy, even in the Green Party, sometimes it's like difficult to kind of set back and try to kind of really look at how did we get here, and like to understand the kind of the deep political and structural and power negotiations that have had to go on for many years, and how we therefore start to kind of strategize about how we build something new and what it will take. And the importance of working class movements, as you've highlighted throughout, I think is a really important, exciting takeaway. So if you have questions, you can send them in the chat box directly to Jane, and who has brackets question mark here, questions here or something in her name. So please do send them through as we go, but we have had some come through in the meantime. So I'll start off with, why don't we go with a big one to start off? Is that nice, Sam?
Yeah, why not?
Actually, you did mention actually just a note on the alternative media, as that was kind of one of your kind of like closing points. We had just one person who asked what is alternative media, and another person who was just asking what is the role of alternative media in building a radical democracy in your eyes?
Well, alternative media, so there is maybe a question of definition here. So alternative media, you could say that it's anything that is an alternative to the BBC or the billionaire press that is organized along slightly different lines and, you know, is motivated by something other than profit. But maybe a more useful thing to call it is oppositional media, which is in fact something that's saying that we're here because we're not happy with the status quo, and we're going to organize things in a different way, and we're going to operate by a logic other than making profit off the back of our content, essentially. And, you know, we've seen Bristol in particular has got a really vibrant alternative media scene. It's growing in some of the northern cities in England as well. Here in Wales, the alternative media, maybe not so much the oppositional media, but the alternative media is growing kind of along with the independence movement, because people have seen that if we want to get more people talking about these ideas, then we need the people to be reading and consuming a Welsh media, because the mainstream media, you know, most people in Wales consume London newspapers or London TV channels, for example. So the role of alternative media in reforming democracy, you know, I'm not an expert in like how you build these things or what the great models are, other than like they should be in some way on cooperative lines, that they should be accountable to their readers in some way. I encourage people to find out about Dan Hind. He's on Twitter, where he's written a book called The Return of the Public. But his big thing is that, you know, we don't have this assembly that we talked about in ancient Greece, where people came together in an egalitarian way to exchange views, change each other's opinions, and be transformed by that process. Where that thing that happened in ancient Greece, that used to be mediated through the media, and we used to have like more grassroots media. Unions had newspapers, the Labour Party had newspapers. There used to be a lot more of it than what we have today. But that we need more grassroots media that we have accountability over, if we're to actually have those egalitarian conversations that are not set on the terms of the ruling elite. So, you know, the BBC, for example, they're just reporting what the government says as if it's the truth quite often. And, you know, I'm not one for dunking on Laura Kongsberg in the way a lot of people do quite unfairly, but it's almost like client journalism, that it's not being, you know, they're not saying, why have 100,000 people died? It's reporting the fact that Boris Johnson feels very sorry about that. So yeah, it's about changing the way those things are framed. It's about how these alternative media are owned, but it's about how we relate to it as well, that we have to be active in some way, not just passive consumers of it.
Thanks so much, Sam. That was really helpful, I think. And hope that answered your questions. They're great. And the next one, I thought maybe it would be good to just start with a big open one, which someone has raised, which is just, does Sam believe a platform of radical democratic reform could be popular in the UK? A big question.
Yes, I do, but it's very important, like, how you talk about it. So if you think about what happened with Brexit, you know, the Leave campaign managed to make a constitutional issue that no one was really talking about even a few years beforehand into the outlet for all of people's desires and hope and anger about the way that things had gone over. It was just like people angry about something to do with neoliberalism. Yes, there were racists. Yes, there were bigots that also voted for that, but you could never have got the majority that they did without tapping into very real angers about the way society has been going. And they managed to make our relationship with a transnational body about democracy. And yes, there's elements of like ethno-nationalism in that, but if we use that kind of populist approach in a different way, saying that our lives are bad because we don't have control over the decisions that affect us, the system is rigged, and that there is a package of reforms that will allow us to have a say over our lives. So that, again, just like these previous movements related the constitution, so to speak, to economic reform, to redistributing wealth, I think that needs to be the same thing, that there's a reason inequality is so high in Britain. It's because our political system is so centralized. So if we're going to, those two things are very intertwined.
Thanks so much, Sam. And just as you said that, another question in the chat, which was on a very similar topic that, like, I think resonates well as well, are saying, we've seen protest movements against the status quo in the US, Poland, Bulgaria, Serbia, Belarus, and Russia. Could go on just the past 6 months alone. And so how do we what does that look like? How do we inspire up in the UK? So I don't know if you wanted to add anything on that, but lots to learn from outside and beyond our borders, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I've been back in Wales for 18 months now and was very engaged in like the independence movement before that point, because, I think people will be sympathetic to the idea that if you have an emergency exit door from the British state, you're going to go for it, as people in Scotland almost did last time. So it's almost now that there's kind of a specific project for people in England to come up with what that kind of strategy is to change things, because, and if the UK breaks up, that is going to force a reckoning with the kind of English psyche, the English political psyche. It's like, oh, what do we do with ourselves now? Who are we? Because the English have never had to think about who they are, because they're just the neutral race that rules over everyone else. And Brexit is a lot about that, but I'm hopeful that the breakup of Britain is going to be a big contribution to that, unleashing the progressive English spirit that does exist somewhere down there, but it's just really buried.
Thanks so much, Sam. Actually, we've got quite a few questions on independence coming through, so maybe I'll try and weave them together a bit if you like. But yeah, one person was just interested in knowing whether you think Britain should stay together or have an independent Scotland and Wales. But I think you just touched on that. But the other two questions that we have in relation to this are, one person has asked, why does Scotland need Westminster's permission to have another referendum? Good technical question. And then the second is, do you think that the idea of a Northern English independence will play a larger role in the future British politics, as the case in Scotland and Wales?
Oh, so much interesting stuff in there. So Adam Price, the leader of Plaid Cymru, the Welsh Nationalist Party, got into a lot of hot water a couple of years ago because he was claiming that Wales was England's last colony. And, I think here we all know that minimises like the scale of the brutality on global South countries that Britain invaded a lot later on than Wales. But someone I know actually retorted saying, well, actually England is Westminster's last colony. And that's a really interesting kind of mental shift, isn't it? So, there are some people in England trying to grapple with this question, saying things like, well, England doesn't really exist in any meaningful identity sense. So I think that things like the Northern Independence movement, I love their kind of political analysis, like check out their Twitter, they're great. But the conversation that they're starting is really helpful actually in divorcing England away from Westminster and really polarizing on the kind of like top bottom division rather than kind of us and them division where we're excluding the immigrants from what England is. So yeah, that's anything that destabilizes that status quo is, you know, in some ways it seems because of the way we are at the moment with kind of working class organization and awareness not nearly what it was like kind of in the last century or so, that these kind of like territory based movements that can very possibly be articulating the same sorts of analysis but doing it in a way that people can actually understand. So it's kind of about democracy rather than about class. So Westminster doesn't represent us. The North is going to go, Wales is going to go, Scotland is going to go. So what was the second question, Rosie? It was about Scotland and Wales and why was
Northern England, yeah, perhaps like playing a kind of particular point, and why Scotland need Westminster's permission.
Right, that's actually very relevant to what we've talked about. So we don't have in the UK states popular sovereignty. Power does not legally derive from the public, and it's enshrined in a constitution because we have this unwritten constitution. It's enshrined in Parliament, and Parliament has absolute say over everything, with some, you know, slight legal constraints and the courts having power over things and so on. So if they say no to the Scottish Parliament holding a referendum, then, you know, there's nothing stopping the Scottish Parliament from holding one, but it has implications for international relations, really. So the SNP is very keen on rejoining the EU as soon as possible. So because of what happened in Catalonia, for example, they're really nervous that holding an illegal referendum is going to mean that they can't participate in international institutions. So whereas like Britain is really badly behaved, failed state in the eyes of Europe and the eyes of a lot of the international community because of the way our governments have been behaving, Scotland wants to be this like normal, well-behaved European country, and taking a legal and orderly route out of the UK is an important part of that for them.
Excellent, thank you so much. That was fab, yeah, and nice one for navigating 3 questions at once, sorry. But thank you so much, and these questions coming in are great, so please do keep going. We've got plenty to get through, but and I'll try and merge them together where they kind of fit. But we've had some questions coming in on the well-known abbreviation PR, proportional representation, and we talk a lot about this in the Green Party and in smaller parties, when sometimes I would say actually sometimes radical democracy and PR, I think people use those things interchangeable, but there are some interesting questions. I guess I think what we've been talking about tonight is like how much further we can go than PR. But one person has asked, what would a change to proportional representation change anything? Another person has asked, would a change to proportional representation change everything? And then another person has asked, there are forms of PR in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland and London. How would we change it in sort of smaller city regions like Manchester?
So would PR change anything? Would it change everything? And what can be done at the local level? Yeah.
Perfect, thanks.
Okay. I mean, you know, this isn't a question that I had to engage with a lot in like my last job, because a lot of supporters were very keen on proportional representation as kind of like that, almost a techno fix that would unlock a lot of the other changes that people wanted, and that you're looking at it in a very kind of face value way, and that, well, the outcome of elections is not matching how people are voting. So if we change that, that opens up the door to all these other changes. But, you know, we have to look at what actually is the route to getting to PR. And we know that the Tories will never, ever entertain this unless in some circumstances that I can't even imagine, because they benefit so well from uniting the right-wing vote and benefiting from the left and other progressives from being divided. Now, you know, that there's quite systematic campaigns at the moment to try and get Labour to embrace it. But if you look at the, you know, I only very briefly touched on earlier, but if you think about the way that Labour has swung back so decisively to its kind of like Blairite norm since Keir Starmer was elected, despite those hundreds of thousands of members, it just seems like there's something very deep in the institutions of that party that has bought into the central myths and ideas of the British state, that we just need to get the keys to Westminster and it'll all be fine, without looking at the other structural considerations. So yes, quite a few of their MPs are now backed PR, they're on record as doing that. But the political direction of Labour, I'm not sure that it's going to be a priority again. And yeah, I think that it's natural for Greens to want to prioritise PR, because a voice that the Green Party represents would have much more of a voice that could build the kind of infrastructure of the party, you know, the infrastructure of social movements that we've been talking about a lot over these sessions. But I just don't think that that is the issue that's going to polarize and get enough people angry for that kind of democratic energy that's going to change the balance of forces here, that it needs to be something more populist about like Westminster screwing us all over, linking it in with the economic demands basically. So that's not a very definitive answer, but all I say is it's not enough. It would change something. Sorry to answer that last question. It would unlock some further reforms if we somehow got it. It would make it much harder for the Tories to win elections, because now all they have to do is throw money illegally into a handful of target seats and ruthlessly exploit target voters in a few thousand swing seats, whereas they need to spend far more money on kind of piling up enough votes under a PR system, and it's very likely they wouldn't be able to do that. But the other things of the British state wouldn't change necessarily if you have PR. It's that one change, leaving everything else intact. It might well get reversed in a bad situation. So yeah, starting point definitely, but just because it's the kind of like technical unlocking thing, that doesn't mean it should be the kind of rhetorical thing that we're using to mobilize people for this radical democratic change that so many of us want.
Fab, thank you. And just as we were saying that as well, would you be able to describe what proportional representation is? We just had a quick question asking for a clarification as well. Is that all right?
Yeah, so
I should have started.
The UK has a system called first past the post, which is a majoritarian system where the person that gets one vote more than any of the other candidates wins the election. So that means in Northern Ireland, for example, some people get elected on 30% of the vote or less in their constituency. And that means that very small leads in the amount of votes a party gets lead up to massive majorities in parliament, so that you have like a rotating one party state essentially. So we had a one party Labour state for a while, and now we've seemed to have a one party Tory state basically. Whereas PR means that broadly, and you know there's lots of different systems that make this come out a slightly different way, that under a proportional system, the proportion of seats in parliament broadly matches the proportion of votes cast. So it just means that you don't have that huge inbuilt advantage for the person that happens to come out on top.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sam. Sorry, I should have probably led with that as a preamble, a bit of an explanation. But yeah, that's really helpful and really interesting as well. So thank you so much. The next question that I have, I was going to kind of move away towards, we've got quite a lot of questions talking about, I guess, the ruling elite being like more so than just, as we said, just kind of politicians in parties that can continue to rig the system, and actually the kind of, yeah, the broader elite class that control these keys. And one person has kind of written a preamble for me, so I don't even know where I'm trying, because I'll read it from, because it's really well written, but it kind of comes along into this area. So they begin: tobacco and fossil fuel industries fund disinformation campaigns around the world. 35 think tanks based in the US, UK, Australia and New Zealand have promoted both the tobacco and fossil fuel industry's interests. Of these organisations, 32 have taken direct donations from the tobacco industry, 29 have taken donations from the fossil fuel industry, and 28 have received money from both. They haven't given me a reference, but I will go with this. Two key networks based in around the Koch brothers and Atlas network, all involved in coordinating funding many of the think tanks. So building this knowledge, basically. The question is then, if dark money pipelines and supply chains are disrupted in a tactical way, these think tanks will be starved of their money from the corporate elites. Is there any historical precedence for such a tactic? And how does that play out in I guess the kind of wider question is, how does this relate, this kind of story relate to what we've been talking about today as well?
So again, I want to say last year, but I think it was I think it was last year actually, that a really important book came out by a guy called Peter Geoghegan. He's been doing investigative stuff on dark money in the UK for open democracy for quite a few years now. And this is like the first book in about a decade that's trying to pull together all of those different ecosystems of like private influence. So it's basically about how does private interest dominate democratic debate. And it doesn't get involved in the media so much, but it's more about who is appearing on the media, whose messages are you hearing, and it's about this kind of nexus that includes these think tanks that are basically just like paid lobbyists pretending to have respectable positions and hide the identities of their donors. But with those resources, they're able to like either tap into broad media networks on the basis of just being from that same sort of professional class, or from just having the resources to just like turn up day after day on talking head shows to put forward these views that actually very few of the public actually agree with. Privatizing the NHS, for example, these think tanks put positions forward for that. They're very concerned about the fact that they haven't been able to get the public to believe in the central tenets of neoliberalism. They just tolerate them because I think there's no alternative. So yeah, the think tanks are kind of one of the latest things that are kind of part of that network that's got more and more advanced really in dominating public debate, as if everyone is really right wing and pro giving the rich all the money, when you talk to people, that's just not what people think about things at all on most issues. So it pushes our kind of public debate far to the right of what it should be. What did the person say anything, Rosie, about like what they meant by disrupting these networks and flows of money?
That's all I've got here, but I suppose it's just challenging them, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, there's that you can put requirements on broadcasters to only have on like lobby groups that are transparent about their funding, for example. So all of the right-wing think tanks, for the most part, don't say who funds them, and that's kind of part of their appeal. It looks like kind of neutral injections into public debate. So you could say that we're not going to, media outlets can't have people on if they're going to not say who funds them. There are some kind of technical changes you could make to like electoral law and company law that says that unincorporated associations should have to report the actual origin of their funds. Like there are always going to be some loopholes that can be exploited by that, but you can make it less open than it is now. But the best answer to these kind of oil lobbyists and tobacco lobbyists, in my opinion, is direct action, to say like, how dare you fund these disinformation campaigns that are destroying our future? Take some tactics out of Extinction Rebellion's book, perhaps.
Nice, thank you so much, Sam. And I apologise, this person did give a reference, and I've put it in the chat for you all to read later.
Yeah, no, they're
questioning. Yeah, so thanks. That was a terrific question, and thank you for a really thoughtful answer as well, Sam. The next question I have is very simply put, what is your idea for an ideal system? So I guess what does radical democracy really look like, and what should it look like? And do you have a kind of vision and idea for features of what that would look like for our audience today? This might be our last question, I'm afraid.
Yeah, it's nice to kind of zoom out a little bit and be a bit more utopian here, isn't it? So I was really excited when I came across this book last year called Democracy May Not Exist, but We'll Miss It When It's Gone, where it kind of starts off on this idea that actually democracy can mean something really participatory, where everyone gets involved in the decisions that govern our lives, but that it's been hemmed in by elites basically to stop us taking all their stuff. And what she says is that there is no like perfect democratic model, that designing the system that we're happy with as a public is always going to be like a series of conflicts between different poles, basically, and saying what is it that we're happy with. So, you know, there is a conflict between like professional opinion and mass opinion. So should we be hiving off decisions about economic policy to economic experts, for example, or should the public have a say in what interest rates are? That is something that we're never going to have a definitive correct answer to. And in the same way, like, how do you have like local subsidiarity, so people making decisions at the lowest appropriate level, without allowing a global system where one like nation can just like destroy the progress that everyone else is making on climate change, for example. So there's quite a few different like poles like this that we have to navigate. But what I would say is that, you know, in an ideal system, we would use representative democracy only to the extent that it's necessary, rather than making it the main thing that we do. So we try and get rid of this idea that we have a professional political class that goes away and makes all the decisions on things that we don't have time to think about. So instead, like, we are bringing decisions down to a much more local level. So councils are giving decisions about how to spend money on public services to people at a hyper-local level. That level has more powers, that, you know, we're only at a national level using, we're only like exercising power at a nation state level where that's absolutely necessary to like the collective good, basically. So much more participatory. Things like participatory budgeting are great. And I'd encourage people, if they're really interested in this, to Google something called democratic confederalism. So in one part of Kurdistan that's occupied by Turkey, the Kurdish people have been running this kind of non-state democratic system for quite some time now, where everyone is involved in everything to the largest extent possible. So like, you're not compulsed